And there you have it. The end of the 3-year run where Utah State is competitive with BYU. Welcome to the Blue Cougar Football post-game podcast for BYU and Utah State. And yes, 31-14 win in a game that wasn't even that close was kind of what I was expecting. I've been looking at this, didn't want to say anything, didn't want to jinx BYU or anything like that, because that tends to happen when I look at these historical patterns and things. But I had a pretty strong feeling that this game would turn out this way, because that's just the way, that's the nature of the BYU and Utah State rivalry. Utah State will go through these periods of 3 competitive years, and then they disappear. Meaning they had 1 or 2 really good recruiting classes, they develop and they, give BYU a run for their money for a little while. But then it's just, Utah State's Utah State. And I mean, that's the way college football goes. There's all these different cycles that come and go, and this is just another one of them. You can look back 1981, 82, and 83. Utah State, BYU needed a pick 6 in 1981. Can't remember if it was Tom Holmoe or Todd Shell, but one of those two returned an interception for a touchdown, which basically decided the game. It was Steve Young's first career start, and BYU won 32-26. And that interception return for a touchdown was the final score for BYU. And then the next year, Utah State beat BYU up in Logan, 1982, 20-17. The next year, 1983, coming back, took a Steve Young touchdown run with around 30 seconds to play for BYU to win 38-34. So BYU was 2-1 in that 3-year stretch, but all the games were close. And that's as competitive as Utah State gets when it comes to BYU. They'll win 1 out of 3 in a 3-year stretch where the games are close. The year before that, 1980, BYU put up 70 points, won 70-46 against Utah State. The next year, 1984, national championship year, BYU wins 38-13, and Utah State was a terrible, horrible team. 1 win that year. And that's just the way it goes. So here we had a 3-year stretch where it's competitive. Utah State took advantage of our poor offense and struggling defense, dysfunctional defense, in 2010, and beat us soundly up there in Logan. Then 2011 comes, and we were then still struggling on offense. Riley Nelson comes off the bench, leads an incredible comeback where we win with just seconds to play on a tipped touchdown pass from Riley Nelson to Mitch Matthews. And then last year, a tight 6-3 ball game that BYU wins. So again, BYU is 2-1 in that 3-year stretch. It feels worse than that though, because we're used to blowing out Utah State. And so to have these games tight and close, even though we win, it doesn't feel like we won. It doesn't feel like we're as good as we should be, and the program's where it needs to be at. But here we go, after that 3 years. Before that, 2009, blowout Utah State 35-17, a game that wasn't even that close. And now here we are, 2013, 31-14. So expect again next year. Yeah, I know Chuckie Keeton's going to be back. More on that in a minute. But expect again BYU to win comfortably next year, and it'll be another 15 years, 10-15 years, until Utah State's competitive again. That's just the way it goes. And we can all exhale now. Take a deep breath. Let it go. It's over. Now, speaking of Chuckie Keeton, he did get hurt in the game, and so many people want to use that as an excuse. Well, BYU just won because Chuckie Keeton didn't play. Well, I'm going to do my best to explain why that is not true. And I fully believe had Keeton stayed in the game, played the whole game, the score would have been pretty close to what it was anyways. 31-14, maybe 31-17. It probably wouldn't have been, BYU probably wouldn't have built a 31-7 lead. I mean, maybe it's 17-14 at halftime or 24-14 in the third quarter at some point, but BYU still wins this game by pretty much the same score. And here's why. First, Keeton wasn't playing well at all. Very first play of the game. I mean, he's having a phenomenal year, especially in the touchdown to interception ratio department. 18 touchdown passes to 1 interception on the season. First play, what happens? Kyle Van Noy, interception, runs it back for a touchdown. Okay. And at the time Keeton got hurt, he was 4 of 10 for 26 yards. His longest pass of the day was 7 yards. And 1 touchdown, 1 interception. That touchdown was basically gift wrapped from a BYU turnover. And a pass efficiency rating of 74.8. On the season, well, we'll get to that later. So Keeton wasn't having a good game against BYU, and guess what? That's not the first time that's happened. He's never had a good game against BYU. At least good by his standards. He's always played well below his standard for the season. Go back to his freshman year, 2011. Keeton was 13 of 25 passing for 122 yards and 2 touchdowns against BYU. Pass efficiency rating of 119.4. That's the Riley Nelson Miracle comeback game. So, for the season, 2011, Chuckie Keeton was 106 of 174, 1,200 yards, 11 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, pass efficiency rating of 137.4. That's a full 18 points higher than he was against BYU. Now, last year, his sophomore year, in that loss to a true freshman, Taysom Hill, making just his second start, Utah State scored a measly 3 points. Keeton was 22 of 38 for 202 yards, not even 10 yards per completion. Pass efficiency rating of 102.6. That's 52 points lower than he was the whole season last year. Pass efficiency rating was 154.6 as a sophomore. He completed 275 of 407 passes, which is 67% for the year. 3,373 yards, 27 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He couldn't even get 1 touchdown against BYU last year. And he was playing at the same level this year. 157 pass efficiency rating, completing 69% of his passes. So, and so obviously, his career against BYU, whether you look at it as his career numbers compared to his career numbers, or even game by game and then compare it for each of those seasons, BYU is his nemesis. He just can't play one of his better games against BYU. So I don't expect that had he played the full game that he would have had a good game. He just doesn't do that against BYU. BYU knows how to stop him. And so it was going to end up the same score. And, I mean, just look at the history, too. In their big games, in Utah State's big games, has he delivered a win? Chuckie Keeton wasn't able to deliver a win at Wisconsin last year. He didn't deliver a win at USC this year. He didn't even deliver a win against Utah this year. So, please, spare us the argument that if Chuckie Keeton hadn't gotten injured, Utah State would have won. Not likely that it would happen. BYU's got his number. Okay, another thing I think is huge to point out, and if you missed it, there was a poll question on the site a little while ago. Will Taysom Hill have 1,000 yards rushing this year? Now at that point, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. He had 400 yards in 3 games. The next game, he went out and ran for 165, which put him up to 565. Then it really seemed like, oh yeah, he's going to get 1,000 yards. And then here against Utah State, bam! 9 carries, 14 yards. And this is exactly why I posed that question. Because this is what Bronco Mendenhall and Robert Anae would prefer. They want to see Taysom Hill not have to carry the ball. Let Jamal Williams and some other backs, Lasike, Hine, Algie Brown, which we'll get to a little bit later. I'll get to a little bit later. They want them to do the heavy lifting. If Taysom Hill doesn't have to run for us to win, he won't. And so 14 yards per game won't get him to 1,000 yards by the end of the season. Now I know it's not going to be 14 yards every game, but I think you understand my point. So it's not going to be a goal for the coaches. Like coaches will, if they see, okay, he's close to 400 yards for the game, or he's going to set a certain record, they'll let quarterbacks throw the ball to reach that record. But they won't have him run just to reach 1,000 yards because of what happened last year. So be watching that. I mean, I'd love to see him reach 1,000 yards. I mean, I just think that will be incredible. But don't be surprised if it doesn't happen, and if these types of games become more routine than the 200-yard game he had against Texas. Kyle Van Noy, gotta include him on this with his interception return for a touchdown, 5th career touchdown. And that's just phenomenal. For a defensive player to have 5 touchdowns, throw in the safety he got, that's 32 points scored. The 5 touchdowns is just as many touchdowns as J.D. Falslev has as a wide receiver. Now Falslev does have 2 punt return touchdowns to his credit in his career. So he has scored more career touchdowns overall than Kyle Van Noy, but as strictly offensive and defensive comparison, they're equal on how many touchdowns they've scored in their career. So it's just amazing. I've never seen a defensive player that can control a game, change a game the way Kyle Van Noy can. And I know there's all kinds of nitpicking about him for the NFL, but I just look at that. He has an ability that I've never seen on defense to change a game. There have been some defensive backs, some cornerbacks who are able to do it because they play special teams as well, like the Honey Badger at LSU, Charles Woodson at Michigan. But strictly from a defensive standpoint, Kyle Van Noy is able to change a game better than anybody I've seen. We often refer to quarterbacks being game changers. Kyle Van Noy does that better than anybody else I've ever seen on defense. And that's why if I were an NFL GM, if I were an NFL coach, I would want him. And I would take him in the first round to get him. Okay, one last note. That'll be Algie Brown. I'm happy for him. I'm always happy for any player who's getting to play and live their dream. I mean, I would give almost anything to have been able to do that in college, to play college football for a program like BYU. But I'm not, and I didn't like him getting that many carries that he got. I know he's a tough, hard runner, but I don't know if he deserves that many carries. I realize it's probably because Jamal Williams, it was his first game back from that concussion, and so the coaches were going as easy as possible for him. They didn't want to push Williams any harder than they had to, and we didn't have to. So Brown got these carries with Hine being out, and so that's just my take on Algie Brown right now. Maybe he develops and gets better, but after the Utah State game, I didn't like to see him get that many carries. And if we're in a tighter, closer game, I don't want that to happen. So thanks for listening. That's it. BYU Utah State. Again, great win, 31-14. Thanks for listening. Go Cougars.